The wind howled in eerie, chilling waves, not the gentle whisper of an autumn breeze, but a mournful symphony of desolation, like an invisible spirit weeping just beyond the tattered window of the thatched cottage. The cold did not merely slip through the rotting cracks of the straw-mixed clay walls, but seemed to seep into every cell, every fiber of Alara's being, freezing her to the marrow, making her shiver in relentless waves. She clutched her little son, Thomas, close to her chest, trying to impart what little warmth remained in her frail body to the child. Thomas's tender skin was icy, his lips tinged with blue, and his breathing was shallow and fragile. His cough tore through the silence with a heart-wrenching rasp, not merely the sound of sickness, but the very echo of despair, of life slowly fading away. Each ragged breath seemed to drag the weight of fate itself, of generations of serfs who had struggled and were still struggling to survive. In the air, thick with the biting sting of smoky hearth fumes from the feeble fire, the damp mildew rising from the earthen floor, and the sour stench of sweat from exhausted bodies, Alara could almost feel the presence of their greatest enemy, the one that had haunted her dreams and waking hours for months: winter. Winter was not merely a change of seasons, it was a living entity, a cold, merciless monster poised to devour the weak, the worn-out bodies of those who had toiled and starved. Winter carried death hidden in every snowflake, every gust of wind, every gnawing pang of hunger. Days before this bone-deep cold had set in, Alara and her husband Finn had labored endlessly on Lord Beaumont's fields. Finn, a brawny man with a graying beard, though his eyes still shone with an almost impossible determination, a spark of survival instinct, bore the marks of decades of grueling labor under scorching sun and relentless rain. His hands were strong, pulling each tiny potato, each shriveled grain of wheat from the hardened earth with care, as though they were the most precious of gems, the only stones that might sustain life. They knew all too well that once the snow blanketed everything in a white shroud, turning fields into a frozen wasteland, all work would come to a halt. Then, the scant food supplies stored in the makeshift cellar beneath their home would become the fragile boundary between life and death. A small store, a hidden hoard of provisions that might sustain them for a few weeks if they were lucky. The lives of serfs like them, tenant farmers shackled to the land, were already a life sentence. They were not slaves bound by iron chains, but prisoners confined by the very earth they tilled, shackled by laws, debts, ignorance, and fear. They had no right to choose their lives, no freedom to leave the estate without the Lord's permission, a permission rarely, if ever, granted. Most of their labor, their sweat and tears that soaked the soil, was taken by the Lord, leaving them with only the barest scraps, enough to keep themselves and their families breathing. Every harvest, whether it promised bounty or famine, ended with them bowing, kneeling, handing over the lion's share of their yield, feigning gratitude for being allowed to live on the Lord's land. That gratitude was a bitter humiliation, a profound injustice, but they had no other choice but to accept it. Finn, his calloused hands and the veins on his sinewy arms standing out starkly, was struggling to patch a gaping hole in the roof with bundles of brittle yellowed straw, stiff as wood. He had done this every year, every time winter came, and each year the hole seemed larger, the roof more decayed. The wind still found its way in, carrying with it icy fingers that stabbed at the skin, piercing through his coarse, threadbare clothes. He tightened the straw bundle with trembling hands, not from the cold, but from exhaustion accumulated over countless days of relentless labor from dawn to dusk. His strength was ebbing away, but he could not stop. He had to keep going. For his wife, for his son. "Another winter, Alara," he murmured, his voice hoarse, laced with resignation and a faint glimmer of hope, a hope he wasn't sure he believed himself. He glanced up at her, his eyes weary but still searching for some reassurance. "We'll make it through, won't we?" Alara met his gaze, her eyes brimming with unspoken worry, like an ocean of unshed tears, yet also filled with fierce love and unwavering belief. She knew Finn was pushing himself beyond his limits for her and for Thomas. She knew he bore a burden far too heavy. She nodded, forcing a faint, fragile smile. "Yes, Finn, we'll make it through. We always do." Her words were a whisper of reassurance, not just for Finn, but for herself as well. They had weathered many bitter winters together, had seen loved ones and friends fall to hunger, to sickness, to the cruel hand of fate that gripped the serf's life. Every new grave in the village cemetery was a brutal reminder of the fragility of life, but also a testament to their unyielding will. They had learned how to survive, how to fight against the odds. Outside, the snowflakes had begun to fall thick and heavy, no longer drifting lightly, but descending like an onslaught of white-winged, lifeless birds, erasing every trace of life beneath them, heralding the harsh beginning of a long, grueling trial ahead. The sky hung low and gray, like a mourning shroud draped over the village, and the wind howled on, carrying the whispered voice of death. Alara tightened her hold on Thomas, as if to shield him from all the cruelty of the world beyond. The fear was real, but love was even greater. When snow had covered everything in a bleak white, turning the entire world into an eerily silent painting, life in the village seemed to slow to a terrifying crawl. Every morning, the first thing Alara saw through the small window was a vast, cold sea of snow, promising death and an unending stillness. The fields of wheat and potatoes, their main source of sustenance and lifeblood for the rest of the year, were now just a hopeless sheet of ice. They were like souls long dead, buried beneath the white shroud of winter, no longer capable of offering even the smallest grain of nourishment. The familiar footpaths, once alive with footprints and the laughter of children helping their parents in the fields, were now treacherous and more dangerous than ever. Each step had to be taken carefully, like walking on a frozen lake, where one wrong move could mean a painful fall, or worse, a critical injury no one could heal. Work in the fields had come to a complete halt. The calloused hands of Alara and Finn, once accustomed to gripping plows and sowing seeds, were now useless against the frozen ground. An invisible but ever-present anxiety weighed heavily on their shoulders. The only remaining work to keep themselves alive was chopping firewood to stay warm and hunting, a laughable notion for impoverished serfs like them. Hunting was heavily restricted by the Lord's laws. Lord Beaumont had his own private forests, vast and mysterious, where fat deer and massive boars roamed freely, providing fresh meat for his lavish feasts. Only he and those he allowed could hunt there. Farmers like Finn could only sneak traps for smaller animals like rabbits or squirrels, or scavenge for roots and wild berries hidden under the thin snow. Things even the wild animals had abandoned as too scarce, too hard to find. It wasn't hunting. It was a desperate struggle to find scraps of food, any bit of energy to keep their fragile lives going. Alara often accompanied Finn, her eyes scanning every nook and cranny, every tree trunk, every footprint in the snow, hoping to find something edible. The cold seeped into her very bones, but the gnawing hunger was even more painful. It was like a wild animal clawing at their stomachs from within, leaving them dizzy and weak. Every day, Alara and Finn had to carefully ration every piece of stale black bread, every shriveled potato. They divided their food as if it were priceless treasure, each oat measured with care. Their meals were mostly thin oat porridge, just warm enough to take the edge off, or vegetable soup made from whatever scraps were left in the garden from fall, if there were any. Often, these meals tasted like little more than water, bland and lifeless, but they forced themselves to swallow it because it was all they had. Every bite brought pain, not because the food was bad, but because they knew that each mouthful brought them closer to the day when there would be nothing left to eat. Meat was an unimaginable luxury, found only in dreams or in fairy tales. Mothers told their children to ease their hunger and make them forget their growling bellies. Occasionally, if luck was on their side, they might catch a small bird that landed nearby or a fish from a stream that hadn't completely frozen over. But such days were rare, and the fleeting joy was quickly drowned by the looming fear of the days to come, of the inevitable depletion of their meager supplies. Thomas, their little boy, was their greatest worry, a deep cut into Alara's mind every second, every minute. He was frail and pale, his eyes sunken from hunger and exhaustion, like a young sapling on the verge of withering away. His coughing grew harsher, ripping through the still air of their home, each cough like a knife to his mother's heart, sharp and helpless. Alara often gave up her own meager portion of food for him, even as her own body wasted away from deprivation, even as her own flesh screamed for nourishment. She knew that each bite she gave him was a piece of her own strength sacrificed, a push closer to her own exhaustion. But the sacred love of a mother overshadowed every fear, every calculation. Thomas had to live. That was all she could think of. Despair crept into her mind like a silent shadow trying to consume her. But Alara fought it off with everything she had, with the iron will of a mother fighting for her child's survival. "You must be strong, Thomas," she whispered, holding him tightly, her breath warming his soft hair, trying to pass whatever warmth, whatever life remained in her into his fragile body. "I won't let you starve. Not ever. I promise." That promise, murmured into the frigid night, wasn't just empty words. It was the thin thread binding them to life, the infinite source of strength that kept them fighting, day by day, hour by hour, moment by moment. The peasant cottages of the Middle Ages, like the home of Alara and Finn's family, were not true sanctuaries. They were merely makeshift shelters, hastily built from the cheapest materials, always on the verge of collapsing under the wear of time and the wrath of nature. The walls were made of a mixture of mud, straw, and wood, a technique called wattle and daub, a crude construction method that had existed for centuries, but by no means guaranteed durability. Whenever a strong wind howled outside, the dry strands of straw on the walls creaked and groaned as if the house itself was in pain, trembling, ready to collapse at any moment and crush the souls huddled inside. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds, offering little insulation, riddled with gaps large and small through which the icy wind easily swept, carrying the bone-chilling cold inside, colder even than the air outside. Sometimes tiny snowflakes, seemingly harmless, would slip through the roof's cracks and fall with a soft patter onto the dirt floor, melting into filthy puddles, adding to the musty smell and making the air even heavier and more stifling. To stay warm, a matter even more vital than eating, they had to keep a fire burning continuously in a small hearth at the center of the house. The hearth was a simple arrangement of a few stones stacked on the ground with no solidly built chimney. The smoke had no proper exit, instead escaping through a crude hole in the roof or through gaps in the walls if the wind happened to blow in the right direction. This filled the air inside with thick, choking smoke mixed with the damp stench, making it hard to breathe and severely affecting the family's health, especially little Thomas. The smell of half-burnt charcoal, damp straw, and unwashed human bodies mingled to create a distinct scent of poverty and struggle, a scent they had become so familiar with that it felt like an inseparable part of life. Sometimes, the smoke built up so thick that their eyes burned and watered uncontrollably, but they had no other choice. The fire was their lifeline, their only source of warmth, the thin boundary between life and death from the freezing cold. Even though it brought smoke and discomfort and even sickness, they breathed in that air day after day, their lungs gradually damaged, though they were unaware of it, or if they were, they couldn't do anything about it. Alara's and Finn's dry coughs grew worse, but they simply attributed it to the cold. Alara's family was no exception. They slept on straw beds spread directly on the cold, damp ground that was always wet from moisture rising up from the earth and from the humidity of their surroundings. At night, the bone-piercing cold crept into every nook and cranny like thousands of needles stabbing into their flesh, seeping through their worn, coarse fabric clothing, making it nearly impossible to sleep. Thomas's cough blended with the sound of the wind outside, and the chattering of Alara's and Finn's teeth became a sad symphony of suffering. To combat it, they layered themselves in as many tattered, worn-out garments of rough wool or linen as they could find, though these were threadbare and no longer offered much warmth, just enough to ward off the worst of the cold. Heavy, scratchy blankets of coarse cloth were pulled up to their necks, but they barely made a difference against the biting frost. Ilara would often wake in the middle of the night, her hand checking her child's forehead, her palms icy cold from the chill, but her heart burning with worry. Sometimes on the coldest nights when the wind howled like a demon outside, clawing and scraping at the roof, threatening to devour them all, they would even sleep with small animals like chickens or piglets to take advantage of their warmth. A desperate act to cling to a bit of life, a way to reassure themselves that they were not entirely alone. The oinking of piglets, the clucking of chickens in the night was no longer a nuisance, but a sound of survival, a reminder that they were not alone in this fight, and the warmth of these small creatures was a precious thing they could depend on. Finn spent most of his daylight hours chopping wood in the nearby forest. It was grueling and incredibly dangerous work, requiring strength, utmost caution, and relentless endurance against the biting cold. Each swing of his axe into the hard, dry wood strained his muscles, his breath forming clouds of white in the frigid air. The dry, sharp branches could easily inflict deep wounds if he wasn't careful, and even a minor cut could lead to deadly infection. He had seen a man from the village crushed under a falling branch, and death came swiftly thereafter from infection and a lack of help. The ground was slippery from snow and ice, and one misstep could result in a broken bone, an unthinkable calamity for a serf, as a severe injury meant certain death due to the lack of medicine or care, and meant his family would be left to face starvation and death. On top of that, he had to contend with other hidden dangers. Hungry wolves roaming the forest, their eyes gleaming with bloodlust in the darkness of the woods, or bandits lurking, men turned savage by hunger, ready to do anything to survive, to steal whatever meager supplies someone else might have. Each morning, when Finn left for the forest, Alara stood at the doorway, her eyes following his figure until it disappeared into the snow-covered pines, her heart filled with an invisible dread, a constant, gnawing anxiety. She knew that each day he went into the woods, he was gambling his life for the survival of the family. But without firewood, they would freeze to death. The fear haunted Alara's mind every time Finn left, easing only slightly when she saw him return. Every evening, when he came home with a heavy bundle of wood on his shoulder, his breath billowing white in the freezing air, his shoulders weighed down not just by the wood but by the burden of responsibility, Alara felt a wave of relief as if a 1,000-pound weight had been lifted. "Thank God you're home safe," she whispered, her calloused hand gently brushing his, seeking warmth and reassurance from his rough, cracked hand, the hand that had labored endlessly for them. The wood was placed into the hearth, the fire flared to life once more, the flames dancing in the air, carrying with them a bit of warmth that chased away the cold and the fear that haunted them, if only for this one night. Winter, for the serfs, was not just a battle against hunger and the harsh cold, but also the season of sickness, a silent, invisible, yet far more ruthless and deadly enemy. It was a merciless vice that squeezed the fragile lives of the peasants, a relentless machine grinding down bodies already worn thin from labor and malnutrition. Their immune systems were already severely weakened by long-term lack of nourishment, surviving on thin gruel and dry potatoes, lacking protein and essential vitamins, making them more vulnerable than ever to any attack. Adding to that, the poor living conditions, damp, poorly ventilated, lacking sunlight, polluted air filled with smoke, and a severe shortage of medicine. They had no remedies other than a few herbs they could gather themselves, meant that even a minor illness like the common cold could turn into a nightmare. Colds, pneumonia, dysentery, or even small infected wounds from fieldwork, all could become a death sentence for them, as they had no medical support, no healers, no money. A slight fever could easily become the end, pulling a life of struggle into oblivion. Thomas, Alara's little boy, was growing visibly weaker, like a candle flickering in the wind, its light wavering and threatening to go out at any moment. The child was thin and pale, his eyes sunken from hunger and exhaustion, like a young tree about to wither, with no strength left. His cough never ceased, tearing through the stillness of the house, each cough a stab into his mother's heart, a torment of helplessness. His fever rose and fell unpredictably, his small body trembling violently, lips cracked and dry, skin pale and clammy to the touch. Alara tried every folk remedy she knew, passed down from one generation to another, taught by the village elders believed to possess knowledge of herbs and illnesses. She applied poultices of herbs on her son's forehead, wild plants hastily gathered from the nearby forest, hoping they might reduce his fever, soothe his suffering. She gave him decoctions made from bark, from roots reputed to have medicinal properties, but nothing seemed to help, and Thomas's condition worsened. She prayed incessantly, kneeling before a small, crudely carved wooden figure of Christ in the corner of the house, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks, pleading for a miracle from above, a glimmer of salvation, divine intervention. Her desperate gaze followed her son's every shallow breath, each one a tug of war between life and death, a battle she was powerless to fight, unable to do anything but watch. In the village, several other children had already succumbed to this harsh winter, their fragile souls departing their emaciated bodies, leaving behind heart-wrenching wails of grief from their parents, cries that still haunted Alara during sleepless nights, becoming a lingering terror. Alara was terrified. The fear of losing her child gnawed at her soul, more painful than any physical wound she had ever endured, a primal, indescribable anguish, a mother's deepest fear. Finn, too, was constantly searching for ways to help. He could not bear to see his child suffer. He tried to find rare medicinal herbs deep in the forest, braving the skin-cutting cold and lurking dangers. Starving wolves, thieves turned desperate by hunger. He recalled the knowledge his grandmother had passed down about medicinal plants and their uses. But these were hard to find in winter with everything covered in snow, and he did not have enough knowledge to accurately identify them. He couldn't take Thomas to the healer in town, as it was too far, a dangerous journey he dared not risk with a sick child, and they were too frail to walk such a distance in this weather. Besides, they had no money to pay the healer. Serfs had no property or money to afford such luxuries, which were privileges reserved for the nobility. The peasants had no access to modern medicine, an extravagance available only to the aristocracy and the well-off. They could only rely on folk remedies passed down through generations, fervent prayers, and sheer luck, a resource sorely lacking in their lives, as if fate itself mocked them cruelly. Every cough of Thomas, every tremble of his frail body felt like a dagger to Alara and Finn's hearts, driving them to the edge of despair. They were powerless, utterly powerless against the illness, yet not entirely hopeless. They could only do everything within their remaining strength, praying for a miracle from the heavens, a final glimmer of hope to save their beloved child, the one they cherished more than their own lives, their only hope for the future. In the darkest days, when the shadows of despair seemed to engulf everything, when all was cold and hopeless, when hunger and sickness clung to them like two ferocious demons with no escape in sight, sometimes there were still faint glimmers of hope, just enough to light the dim road ahead, just enough to keep them tethered to life, to faith in a better tomorrow, a life no longer surrounded by fear. One day, as Finn was desperately searching for food in the desolate forest, his stomach growling with hunger and his limbs numb from the cold, he nearly gave up. He collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, gasping for breath in the frigid air, tears freezing at the corners of his eyes, feeling as though all his strength had been drained, all hope had vanished. But then, as if by a miracle, his eyes landed on a small rabbit warren, cleverly concealed beneath a withered bush, nearly buried under the snow, a sign of life he thought he would never find. It was a precious discovery, a sign of life amidst the endless icy expanse, a whisper of hope, a gift from fate. Without hesitation, even though his hands were numb to the point of losing all feeling, he dug tirelessly through the thick, frozen snow, bit by bit. His hands, raw and bloodied from the cold and scraping against the ground, did not falter. Not for a moment did he consider giving up. The fear for his sick child, his wife, and the family freezing and starving at home gave him extraordinary strength, pushing him past all physical pain and fatigue. Finally, miraculously, he caught two plump rabbits, still warm, trembling in his hands. It was a feast they had not dared dream of for weeks, a gift from fate, a sudden spark in the thick darkness of winter, driving away the shadows of hunger. Alara quickly lit the fire, her hands trembling not from cold, but from overwhelming emotion, from a joy so intense it could not be contained, a joy that had not graced her hollow face in a long time. The aroma of roasting rabbit meat filled the small thatched cottage, awakening the dulled senses of the entire family, souls that had not tasted fresh meat in far too long. She carefully prepared a hot, fragrant rabbit soup, rich and nourishing, spooning it gently for Thomas, cooling it bit by bit, each spoonful a fragment of hope entering his frail body. Thomas, though still weak, his little eyes tired and glazed, opened them to gaze longingly at the soup and managed to swallow a few spoonfuls. Each warm mouthful sliding down his delicate throat brought a hint of vitality, a precious surge of energy his body so desperately needed. That night, the boy slept a little better, no longer writhing with fever, no longer coughing those heart-wrenching, racking coughs. The coughs lessened, fading to faint, weak sounds, a whisper of illness retreating, a promise of recovery. It was a tiny, fragile sign, but enough to rekindle hope in Alara and Finn's hearts, a hope they had thought forever lost, a small flame kindled in the winter night. Tears streamed down Alara's cheeks, tears of joy and relief, of boundless gratitude, of a mother's sacred love triumphing over despair, over the fear of death. They also received a bit of help from other peasants in the village. Though everyone was struggling equally, each fighting for survival, each teetering on the brink of hunger and death, they shared a strong sense of community, bonded like an extended family, an unbreakable unity. They understood that in this freezing cold and hunger, only sharing could see them through. Only human kindness could warm hearts frozen with fear. They shared even dry pieces of bread, small bundles of firewood, and lent each other a hand when someone fell ill. Old Maria, an elderly woman from the village with a deeply wrinkled face and gentle eyes, brought Alara some dried herbs she had carefully stored from the summer, precious herbs she had saved for herself, now offered to share. She kindly showed Alara how to brew the medicine for Thomas, how to care for him so he might recover, passing down her valuable knowledge. Old John, though stooped and weary, managed to bring Finn a few dry potatoes he had kept safe in his cellar. Potatoes already sprouting, but still a precious gift, an act of kindness and solidarity. This spirit of unity was one of the most crucial factors that helped them survive the harsh winter. They knew that without each other, if everyone cared only for themselves, no one could weather the snowstorm alone. No one could survive in isolation. The faint laughter, the gentle touches of encouragement, the sincere words of support warmed their hearts on the coldest winter nights, more than the fire in the hearth, more than the rough blankets. It was the warmth of humanity, of belief in each other, an invisible but powerful energy that helped them cling to life. Gradually, bit by bit, the brief days of the harsh winter began to lengthen, slowly but surely, like a promise from the heavens already foretold. The sunlight, once feeble and rare, now grew warmer and brighter, piercing through the gray clouds, warming the crooked thatched huts, bringing with it a gentle breeze signaling change. Snow began to melt, patches of white giving way to moist, tender brown earth, heralding a powerful renewal, a cycle of life, a new beginning after death. The small stream, once almost entirely frozen, now babbled once more, carrying with it the sound of life, of freedom, of what had been trapped, now released from the shackles of ice. Birds chirped somewhere in the forest, joyful sounds after days of eerie silence, as if announcing the coming of spring, a new beginning full of hope, a welcome to the return of life. The first tiny buds unfurled on barren branches, a fresh green symbolizing hope and change, the resilient vitality of nature, the determination to rise again after storms, the belief that after every hardship, life will continue.